2019 Agrichats. We are hoping you'll participate in the discussion. We've got a panel of experts, but we want you to put your 2 cents worth in, and basically we're trying to keep it as a positive discussion looking at the future of food, specifically the future of protein in 2019. Looking forward to the future because, as we know, the world population is going to increase to 9 billion people by 2050. That's going to need a 70% increase in the amount of food we produce. Protein's going to be a very, very big part of that because of the demand we're seeing in Asia and in Europe as well. And so we're looking at some of the options, some of the possibilities for the future. But it will have some challenges, of course. So we want to go through some of those options, some of those challenges, and some of those opportunities. Joining us today in our panel discussion for Agrichats here at the Royal Agricultural Society, we're joined first of all by Olympia Yaga, who is the founder and CEO of insect farm GoTerra. She's also a founding director of the chair of Insect Protein Association of Australia. So she'll have some interesting things to talk about in terms of insects and creepy crawlies and the fact they may be on your dinner plate soon, or maybe on the dinner plate already, Olympia. George Pepu is, he said I shouldn't be talking about Franken meat. Sorry, I just did. But he's involved in lab meats, and we've seen quite a lot of that on our television lately. The Israeli scientists are working on it. They say it tastes terrific. We'll be talking about lab meats with George shortly. Also, Georgie Ailey from KPMG. She's a food and agribusiness consultant. Also involved in the Australian Institute of Food Science and Technology, which is an independent voice for food industry professionals as well. So we'll be hearing from Georgie. And last but not least, Jax Batista is from Meat and Livestock Australia. She's involved in looking at community attitudes and also community leadership in the space of food and meat and protein. So as I said, it's a challenging time for the food industry, particularly in regards to protein and the future and what we need to actually achieve to feed the world. Protein, of course, an important part of that. And I remember being in the offices of MLA several years ago where they were talking about the role that protein had played in human intelligence. When we started eating more protein, the graph exponentially increases the rate of human intelligence. Protein is fundamental to improving the quality of life and generally the intelligence of the human population. So it's something that's absolutely necessary for future development of the world. I might start off by talking to Georgie Ailey from KPMG. Protein, how important is it that we look at all the options in terms of the future for food and protein?
Yeah, thanks, Michael, and thanks to the RAS for putting on this topic today. I think it's a very important discussion point for the sector overall. And why you say challenging, Michael, I think it's the lens of it's actually a very exciting time for the food and agribusiness sector. And what we're seeing, and Michael touched on it, we've got a population that's tracking well towards 10 billion by 2050. We're going to have to increase or double the output of food production in the next 30 years now than what we have in the past, X amount of 1,000 years. So there's a lot of pressure and expectations coming onto this sector around needing to meet the changing consumer demands and population pressures around the world. So we've got a significant amount of trends that are driving that. As everybody knows, we've got a strong shift towards Asia. Asia's growing, they're getting more wealthy, their diets are changing, and their expectations and desire to consume less grain-based or cereal-based traditional foods like rice, wheat, and in some cases even plant-based proteins like pulses, to more animal-based meats or other alternative high-protein options. And we know Asia's strong in the insect space already, and that expectation of Asia's desire to consume more insect protein is also due to grow as well. So what we're seeing is the opportunity to look at an array of proteins and different types of proteins pending the consumer that we're producing for. You know, Australia produces 3 times the amount of food we consume in this country. We're very focused on, you know, our overseas markets and serving them and growing our exports into those key markets. And so there's a huge opportunity to look at not just traditional forms of protein, whether they be from animal or plant. We still consume a lot of plant-based protein along with animal protein, but new proteins, you know, to the Australians or the more Western diets around where they be insects or alternative ways of growing protein, such as what George will cover. So, you know, shift towards Asia, shift in consumer demands, increased desire to westernise diets towards that higher protein, and also the demand to increase our output of protein on diminishing resources and land area. So hopefully that sort of sets the scene as to why, you know, all forms of protein are important, but also is around the balance of those proteins to ensure we've got, you know, healthy populations all across the world.
I might also now get you to hand the mic over to Jax Baptista, who's at Meat and Livestock Australia, because we were touching on the issue of animal protein, but also plant protein. I mean, does that mean if plant protein is the way that many people are talking about the future, does that mean that we're going to see less beef cattle farms, less lamb production, and more people targeting the Australian farm to grain protein?
Oh, thanks, Michael. Well, we're seeing, as Georgie said, 2/3 of the product that we're actually producing in Australia is being exported, and we can see that market just continuing to grow. So we don't see that affecting the actual production of the cattle at all. Most Western countries, we're seeing an evening off of red meat consumption. Often that is due to the fact that we have a whole lot more protein being introduced to the diet, whether it be insects, whether it be plant protein, or just alternative meat proteins that George will touch on later. We know that red meat is a really healthy, balanced part of a diet. We know that it's a whole food. We know that it's a pure whole food. So we know that as far as diet's concerned, that is actually what people are looking for. And we will continue to grow good, healthy, whole food for the Australian public.
Does that mean, I guess, that we may have to pay more for it in the future? And in terms of, I mean, there'll still be the increasing population, there'll still be the demand. The demand will presumably increase. There's probably a limit to the amount of meat we can continue to produce. We'll have to pay more for it.
I think we can see, and I think we've seen over the last 6 years, a fairly serious drought across Australia, particularly up in Queensland. They really haven't had much relief in about 7 years. People are becoming really resilient. Producers are becoming very smart in the way they're producing red meat, and they're becoming very efficient. So we know only 8% of Australia's land is arable. So that means we can only grow crops on 8% of the land. So it's actually perfect for grazing animals, ruminants such as beef and lamb. So we don't see the production being limited so much as long as we keep farming smart as far as using our water resources well, planning for the future, planning for drought, and looking at that really professional way graziers are actually approaching the way they're producing cattle and sheep. Then I can't see it actually affecting that part of production. Demand will probably, depending on where we go, particularly with that Asian market, if we do see an incredible rise in the economic structure in China, for example, we will see demand grow, therefore that will affect pricing.
Okay, just a reminder too, we want the audience to be involved. Any questions you've got of the panel, might go through and have a chat to each of the panel members first, but have a think about some questions you might ask them in regards to the topic of protein, food, the future. George, we were talking about lab meat. You've been involved in this space, Grow Lab, for quite some time. You're the founder of Grow Lab. What are we talking about when we're talking about growing meat in a petri dish? And how are we going to get that from a petri dish onto our dinner plate for a reasonable amount of money?
Good question. All right, so who here is familiar with cellular agriculture or lab-grown meat? A couple of you? Good. So basically all you do, it sounds really simple. You take a little bit of a living animal You don't kill that animal, you don't hurt that animal, you take a little biopsy and you place it in an environment which simulates being inside of the muscle. And that is basically a media broth that contains some amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein, some salt and some other nutrients, and you keep it warm and those cells divide and they grow. And importantly, they grow into real meat. They don't grow into, it's not fake meat, it's not a substitute meat, it is real, authentic meat, biologically identical to what you find from the animal. The cost of doing this right now is thousands of dollars a kilo because it's done at very, very small scales. And the inputs, all the things that go in are being bought from research providers at extremely high costs. At scale, we're going to get down to a couple of dollars per kilo. These are going to be very, very cheap products. And they're going to be able to improve much faster than animal products can improve because you can go through a generation of this in a day or two, as opposed to a couple of years if you're breeding animals. So what it comes down to in my mind, the threat of alternative proteins grown outside of animals, because these are biologically identical to meat, these are the same thing as meat. The threat comes from how people respond to that. So just quick question, who here eats meat and enjoys it? I'm gonna stick my hand straight up. When you take a bite of a delicious juicy steak, how often do you think, I'm really glad an animal had to die so I could have this? Because that's going to be the psychology we're facing up against. It's going to be a choice between having a product which is biologically identical, tastes identical, but nothing had to die, and a product which involved the death of an animal. So that's the big psychological challenge that conventional animal agriculture faces here. I can see Jax cringing to my left.
I think the important point, Michael, that we don't want to lose is consumers have choice. And so at the end of the day, we don't want to take the choice away from consumers. So a consumer will choose to consume what sits and works with their own value system and what aligns with, their desires from a consumption perspective. And so I think, yes, important. George is dealing and looking at a particular consumer base. But I think for consumers, it's making sure we're very clear in the discussion today that it's about choice. And it's about providing that choice to consumers, whether that be an Australian consumer, a consumer in China, a consumer in North America. I think we just need to maintain that focus on choice.
Any questions about that in regards to... Anyone got a question?
No one.
No questions? As yet? Have a think about questioning, because we're going to talk about insects.
Maggot time.
Maggots. And, well, not just maggots.
Maggots are all that matters, though.
Interesting point, though, that George was making there in regards to a philosophical issue in regards to meat.
Sure.
Do people have similar issues when you think about, crickets on the table?
Of course. Food is everything. Food is cultural. Food is emotional. Food is how we show our love. Food is how we celebrate. And so any discussion around food has to involve conversations of social license from both sides of the aisle and always cultural connotations around food. And it's really interesting to me to sit here today in 2019, because in 1995, I was over at the Cattle Pavilion with 6 Charolais and 4 Ménageurs, and I was showing for 2 weeks straight. And so now I'm sitting on this stage as a maggot farmer trying to sell a different kind of protein in a different kind of world. And I think when I consider it that way and I watch people's reactions to different conversations from different speakers, I can really ride the wave with everybody, because I understand what it feels like to have the thought of lab meat, because that's like, no, I want it walking around, and I want to have that part of that beautiful history of cattle being grazed in Australia. But I disagree with Jax. I think production-wise, Australia is going to be challenged to meet the demands, and PwC has done reports, other organisations have done reports. Physically, Australia cannot increase production by the required amount for the needs of 2050. That's like a pretty much agreed upon fact. And so whilst choice is going to be important, also how we get those needs met and provide enough choice for all the socio-demographics in our country and the world are going to be important. So we think insects have a role to play in that, because my farm has had more harvests in 3 years than Australia's oldest wheat farmer. We farm 300 kilos of protein per cubic metre, and I use less than 400 millilitres of water per kilo of protein. I'm farming insects for human consumption and for livestock feed. And so, but those conditions don't change for either direction of the supply chain. So when I consider production of protein, I think about ecosystems and supply chain. Where do insects fit in the existing narrative if we consider that people will want choice and people will have cultural alliances? So some people will never want to eat an insect. We've centuries tried to kill them and said, don't eat anything that has had an insect in it. And now we're like, please take this bug, it's delicious. I don't care how many times you tell me it tastes like a cashew. If I am violently averse to insects, I'm not going to want to put it in my mouth. So the job isn't for me necessarily to change the minds of those who are really aligned with certain philosophies. It is instead to provide choice to those who are open and have a social justice agenda around environment. And so that's how we see insects playing. I don't really buy into the yuck factor. I say the word maggot. I raised sheep for a long time, so I was a maggot farmer in the 90s. I'm a maggot farmer now. It's just in different spaces. And so for me, it's more about, I'm going to go out in the world and we're going to do this thing. We're going to raise some protein. We're going to sell it to some humans. We're going to sell it to some livestock feed. And we're going to fit because of that, because Australia is getting more and more pinched, particularly by climate change, in its ability to make that 8% of arable land be as productive as it always has been. And so farming-wise, we're going to need more choices so that we can de-risk our businesses. So maybe if you have to destock your conventional livestock, you can be farming mealworms in a dark box with zero water requirement and still have income on farm. I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Well, I mean, the yuck factor is something you have to acknowledge, though. I mean, that is something that,
Sure.
there is that, and I know you say it's not an issue for you, but it may well be an issue. Or will it be overridden by the need for protein, and so we'll package it in a different way so we don't
Sure.
have to acknowledge that?
So the way I look at it, any emerging industry has a niche market they can apply itself to, and I tell the story anecdotally by reminding us all about quinoa. Remember when quinoa came out and everyone's like, quinoa's the new superfood, everyone must eat quinoa, and we're like, what is it? And it was like $40 for 200 grams, and then they sold it to us and they said, oh, it's like rice, but then you boiled it for 8 hours and it wasn't like rice at all, and it was like still crunchy, and we're all like, I don't know how this works. And then somebody realised that if you put it in salads and muffins and all those sorts of things, it became something that we could culturally appropriate, because quinoa with beef stroganoff, not so great. Quinoa in a muffin is healthy and fibrous and good for me, and so then I can eat my muffin. And now I've reduced my guilt on muffin eating, but I've also get to jump on the superfood bandwagon. Insects are the same. Right now, our target market is big enough for the industry as it stands. It's an emerging industry, so our target market are the young couple driving Subarus with kids whose names are Oscar and Griffin, and they have hemp sandals and plastic straws in their bags. Great, there's plenty enough of them around for me and my market to start to grow. By the time insects become mainstream to that demographic, just like quinoa, you will find it in your muffin, in your superfood aisle. It's going to be on the shelves in Woolworths in the next 2 months. So,
I might go to George again. You were talking about the environmental credentials for insects, but you've got some pretty good environmental credentials in terms of lab meat, apart from the yuck factor in that as well too. But you were running through earlier with me about water use, and just run through some of those environmental benefits you see from using the lab instead of the paddock.
So quick, just something I want to correct you on, Michael. Labs are where you do experiments. We're going to basically...
But it sounds good, George.
It does sound good. Lab meat sounds great, but what this is going to look like, when this becomes a commercial product, you're going to walk into what's essentially a brewery, but instead of beer coming out of those tanks, it's going to be meat. But it's going to look, for all intents and purposes, exactly like a brewery. It's not going to look like a scary, creepy clinical lab with Petri dishes everywhere. It's going to look like your local microbrewery where you go and hang out with your friends on a Sunday afternoon. But in terms of the environmental credentials, depending on whose numbers you look at, it's somewhere between 90 to 98% less water usage, about 93% less greenhouse gas emission, and around 99 or 98% lower overall energy footprint for it as well. These are very, very low footprint and low impact techniques that are being used here. And importantly...
And how much per kilo?
Well, right now, thousands of dollars. But, you know, how much was a laptop back in the 90s? I remember my dad bought a really shitty IBM ThinkPad for $7,000 back in 1997. And you can now go and buy a laptop, which is infinitely better than that, for about $200 from JB Hi-Fi. And so looking at cost right now is a bit of a red herring, is we have seen consistently any industry which relies on technology, emerging technologies, gets much, much cheaper, much, much faster than people expect. And so yes, it's extremely expensive now. It probably won't be extremely expensive in 20 years. And in 40 years, it will probably be absurdly cheap. And so that's the sort of time frame we need to be thinking about here.
So we're talking about $1 a kilo, something like that, maybe $1.50 a kilo.
$1 to $2 a kilo ballpark price, but could get cheaper.
And is it going to be like, it's going to be mince on the shelf at the supermarket? Is that how it's going to be delivered, or what's the situation?
There's lots of different ways it can be delivered. Early products are all going to be mince-like products. They're going to have no real structure to them. Later, as you start to get three-dimensional structured products, there's going to be an ability to emulate any kind of meat structure. You could go for a fillet steak, you could go for a lobster tail, you could go for a fish fillet. You can have any type of structure that you want.
So you just turn the dial on the machine.
Basically, yeah. And one of the weird things about this is, unlike animal products, there's not an inherent scarcity in some components. Like fillet steak is a tiny amount of the animal, and so it's more expensive because there's not much of it. With a fully factory cellular agriculture approach, is you can produce whatever you want at roughly the same price point. So if you want lobster tail, that's going to cost you as much as your hamburger meat. And that does a lot of weird things to food economics and what we think of as valuable foods versus less valuable foods. But these are all the sort of unintended second-order consequences that come with the new technology that people aren't even thinking about now. I mean, no one thought that Facebook would lead to crazy election influencing back when Mark Zuckerberg was coding this up in his dorm room, but these are the types of unintended consequences we know happen when you introduce a technology which sort of breaks our existing societal structures.
I saw you were nodding there, Georgie, Ailey. Is there something you wanted to add to that? Or are we going to see, is it going to be the end of, if we can produce high quality protein, lobster tails at $1.50 a kilo, then where does that place the family beef farm or lamb production? Is it going to be choice?
Yeah, look, I think back to Jax's point, you know, and the discussion around how much we export and who we're producing these products for. You know, there is increasing demand. There's increasing number of mouths we've got to feed globally. And so alternative forms of agriculture, and Olympia touched on that, you know, there is the pressure on resources. We do have limited land, we've got limited water, and even more, you know, needing to be produced from less. And that demand is there. So we're seeing the increase in vertical farming. We're seeing the increase in, you know, protected cropping. We're seeing the increase in, you know, lab-based stuff or the work that Olympia's doing. And at the moment, Jackson, unless I'm incorrect, I don't think we're seeing many cattle producers displaced by that, probably more displaced by drought and floods. You know, we look at the impact of floods in northern Australia, you know, and how much that's outstripped from our supply, and how much that will have an impact not just now, but at least for the next 5 years. It'll take to rebuild the Northern Australia cattle industry. So I don't think it's an issue, Michael, around displacing the current farmer. I think what we're also seeing is an ageing population in farming. We are, yes, seeing younger farmers coming back, but we're also seeing new farmers enter the industry, aka some may call George. a farmer. There is George the farmer, actually. And you know, people like Olympia, who used to be in cattle and are now in insects. And so, you know, we might see more people producing food rather than less people, you know, in terms of what we call a traditional farmer might not be the stereotypical farmer of the future, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it allows for different forms of production, and it allows for Australia, from our role in feeding not just our own mouths here but those overseas, an opportunity for us to grow our role in that through new forms of production. And Olympia's shaking it.
Any questions? Yeah, I was actually going to ask Jax a question about the follow-on from the family farm question next. But any questions from the... Got a question down there? The question was, can you incorporate the marbling in the lab meat?
Short answer is yes. There's a lot of really complicated underlying science about how you do that, and right now that's really, really difficult, but the short answer is yes.
I just wanted to ask Jax to follow on from the discussion about the family farm and technology. We've got some more questions somewhere. I'll come to you in a sec. I just wanted to ask, so is there a possibility, or is there a need maybe for some of this technology in terms of the future of protein that we're talking about here with Olympia and George, for family farmers to adopt and adapt and boost production?
Oh, look, I think we're seeing graziers all across the country and farmers from all different production types and systems adopting technology and embracing it. I mean, even in the short term, we've seen the introduction of autonomous vehicles and drones and these sorts of things that are dramatically reducing the amount of man hours that are required to check fences and check water and those sorts of manual jobs that used to take a lot of man hours and a lot of time and expense. So we've seen that sort of stuff embraced. We've seen, you know, satellites being driven off iPads to actually locate everything from tractors to other pieces of machinery and mechanics. What we've also seen is the adoption of looking at more biodiversity. So people aren't looking at necessarily farming one type of cattle or livestock or one type of vegetable or crop. They're looking at actually bringing in polycultures to actually have these things actually complement each other, increase their yield, and therefore increase the viability of the farm itself. So rather than, you know, seeing vast cattle farms necessarily, we're seeing more people rotationally graze, and put more pulses in, for example, put more crops in, then use, you know, obviously the manure from the animals to then generate the land in the next phase. We're seeing people farming smarter than they have in the past, and we're seeing by doing that they are increasing yields, they're increasing profits, and they're actually being able to do that and doing it with the idea of having a future for not only their children but their grandchildren. So it's not that we're not being affected by choice. Of course, every industry is being affected by technology. This morning on the Today Show, they were talking about how newsreaders will be dead, the job will be gone in 10 years. You know, every job is being affected by technology. It's about how we adapt, it's about how we embrace that technology and embrace the change. Obviously, you know, everyone has a place in this food system. It's a matter of how we play that part and doing it responsibly and doing it with a conscience and doing it in the best and most effective way that we can do it.
Hi, I'm wanting to know about how you measure the resources that are put into the various forms of production. People have spoken about energy usage, water usage, etc. I don't see sort of like a star rating on stuff that I buy at the supermarket that tells me, you know, how much water is used per gram of production, etc., and electricity. So I was wondering, is there an agreed system that's already in place that hasn't got out into the retail space yet, or is that something that's still under development?
Yeah, Georgie and I were actually both saying good question. Very difficult to answer objectively. From a grazier's point of view, water use, for example, is calculated on how much water falls from the sky. So how that then diverts back into the actual production of an animal is quite subjective. So I know a lot of producers in our industry don't like that particular measure. And also that means the more intensive the production system is, the less that water measure is, which is not necessarily what people want to see in a welfare situation. So there's some contradictions in there as we work towards those ethical parts of measurement, but it is something we're obviously working towards. The cattle, sheep and goat industries have made a commitment to work towards carbon neutral by 2030. So that's all about not just tree planting, but obviously reducing the emissions from the animals themselves. We're looking at many, many aspects of the industry of how we can lower those impacts on the environment. But unfortunately, there is no silver bullet from our point of view.
And I'll just take a grains hat, having spent time in the grains industry. So we have very, industry adopted and accepted benchmarks for how we measure water use efficiency, and we've done that over several decades. So it's not a silver bullet to say, here's a single metric, we work to that. So that's a combination of variety, so what we actually plant in the ground, and trials that are done that look at how much rainfall, fertiliser, or I guess food for that seed do you need to produce a certain amount of volume of production. So we talk about tonnages of wheat produced or tonnages of chickpeas produced. And so how deep did you plant that seed? How much rain was fell throughout that particular season window. Sometimes we have crops under irrigation, so we water them more than just using water from the environment, and then we look at how much food, so fertiliser, did we need to give them to grow, and what the grains industry has done is measured that over several decades, where we know we're getting drier across the country. We can actually break those measurements down into regions, so you can look at how effective and efficient were we in our water use in this region versus this region, because we get different rainfall. Different varieties grow in different regions. So it's not as simple of just a single benchmark. As an industry, we've built that up over time. And then what we've done is look at how do we grow or develop seeds that are still performing in terms of still being able to provide us with the same tonnage or output of production without the same amount of resources to grow that. So they can grow with less water, less food, and still provide the same amount of output for us to produce that. So hopefully that sort of helps. And so as an industry, we talk about water use efficiency, measuring that and benchmarking that, and grain producers have adopted that for a long time.
It was interesting you mentioned that, because I remember there's an ABARES report about cotton growing and the amount of water needed for growing cotton versus the amount of water, and it was much, much less to produce a kilo of beef, for example, in terms of versus cotton. And I was surprised by that, because I thought that was, I was always told that beef was, a thirsty production process, but cotton is much more water, it needs much, much more water. So when you talk about
I love the saying, it depends.
Yeah.
And I hate comparing one crop to another crop or to another thing.
Well,
so, how we produce... No, get that. But how we produce cotton and what we do as cotton farmers, and hats off to cotton farmers who do a bloody good job. And there are a lot of jeans in the room and a lot of cotton T-shirts, so good on you. But, the cotton industry as an industry has worked hard, and they have their own measurements to reduce and monitor. I mean, if someone can monitor a drop of water, it's probably, a cotton farm that can do it pretty bloody well. And I'd say rice growers are pretty good at that too. And then, how you produce, and you look at the ecosystem of beef production, or you look at the ecosystem of growing a crop of chickpeas. So I think, Michael, we've got to be very cautious about saying, and I hate those charts that show this is how much it does to produce beef and this is how much water it takes to produce this. We've got to remember, we don't just eat beef. We don't just eat wheat. I think what's really important, and for those that aren't in the industry that are sitting in this audience today, welcome, and we love that you're here to hear this conversation, is that, we have holistic foods on our plates. We've got to think about quality of what we consume, not just what we consume. So the protein quality of animal protein is very different to the protein quality of a chickpea or the protein quality of an insect. And so the amount of protein people need, so if you're a 65-year-old female, how much protein you need is very different to an 18-year-old male. So protein requirements are different through stages of life, are different through stages of, development. And so I think we just need to make sure people understand that quality of protein is as important as, what type of protein you're consuming, because it's all interrelated. And then the fact that we are looking at a diet in a holistic sense and not just single sources of protein. So I just want to, not to have a go at you, Michael, but I think we just got to be careful about trying to compare everything as apples to apples, because as we know, it's not that simple.
And Olympia, you were talking about the benchmarking in terms of insects, and you're saying that you've done some benchmarking. We were talking earlier about how much environmentally and
so
insect.
to your question, the insect industry is a vertical integrated farming system. So all insect farmers can measure their inputs because they're all controlled. We add our water, we add our feed, and so there's it's a little easier to manage those metrics. And then the Insect Protein Association of Australia has developed the best practice around management, handling and hygiene, which also feed into that. I think you will start to see packaging that speaks not only to, there's a lot more social license coming out in packaging, right? It started with organic and now we're moving into biodynamic, massaged gently by leprechauns. We're getting lots and lots of different social injustice indicators, and I think energy used or water used to consume will be one that we might start to see. But all industries track their inputs because inputs are cost of production. It's just what we have to track it one way or another. So.
And George, is it easy to track in things like your organisation, like Grow Lab, going forward? Is it easy to track those things?
Well, so with LabMate, same thing as Olympia, it's a vertically integrated industry, so you know everything that's coming into that building and you know exactly how much you're producing, so it's a pretty easy equation to divide output by all your inputs to work out the resource input per kilo or per tonne that's coming out of there.
Questions? Yep.
I'm going to keep it.
At the moment, the discussions around land-based protein, but most of the world today, a lot of our protein actually comes from the sea and the oceans, and obviously, as we see in parts of Africa and China and Asia, the pressure on the fishery system's going to get more intense, and we're starting to see competition for resources there. I think it falls on us all as consumers to certainly think about what sort of new proteins that we need to do and to change our diets, because you go to places like Europe and there's that mythical animal that we like to see at the races at Randwick, but we certainly won't eat it. So I think we've got to look at all of these different proteins, including the horse, including the cane toad, including the camel, and our lovely coat of arms, the kangaroo, and probably the emu as well. So I think it's going to be, I don't think anybody in the audience up the top are competing against one another. I think it's more they're actually are going to have to work together, because we're going to need to sequester carbon via grazing animals. We're going to need to use insects to get certain proteins to cover certain areas, and we're certainly going to need sort of a new way of replicating cells in fish, so we give the oceans a bit of time to recover as well. So I think it's.
I think you're right, and I think it was sort of coming back to what I was going to say earlier, is that it's really easy, and even in this sort of amicable conversation, you can see this really interesting split in between conventional and the new, and somehow it doesn't matter how you craft that conversation, it always starts to feel like I am either an us or a them, and it's this like ongoing conversation of othering, where it's like, oh, if you want to eat beef, then you can't be environmentally friendly, or if you eating insects, you're a bit of a muppet because beef is better, and and these are just sort of stereotypes. I don't know if anyone caught it, but when George talks about making meat at a cellular level, he still needs cows. They need to be upright and walking around. And I think what we're looking at today in agriculture is, in the military, they call it a black swan, which is an unimaginable event that must be imagined for us to truly strategize and contemplate it and prepare for it. And I think about that a lot. It is hard to imagine that cattle farmers, sorry to keep picking on them, may end up being farmers of the cells that we use to make more meat. It's unimaginable to expect that the hay plain will be 50 degrees on average and therefore hard to graze anything. But that's what CSIRO tells us we're going to face. And so what I think is interesting is that neither of the sides of this conversation exist without the other. And I would suggest, certainly from my perspective, but I'm pretty confident from George's as well, is that nobody is trying to do away with that. And it comes back to that conversation that Georgie said around choice. It is likely you will have the choice. And that choice may be governed by your financial capability, whereas if you can afford hoof-grown meat, then you will be able to have it. And if you can't, then you will likely eat cell-based meat or insect or some other kind of meat. We can't imagine that today in this beautiful setting, but that's sort of the unimaginable that we're heading to. So I think it's important to think of these things not as it's either one or the other. It's more about how do we move forward with both those conversations.
Interesting point about the horses too, because of course in Italy there's no problem in eating horse, and mortadella is very, very common use of meat in mortadella is horse. Did you want to comment on?
I was just going to add something to that. This is something which has happened before about 100 years ago. Is just quick show of hands. Who rode a horse to get to the Easter show today? Anyone? Who rode a horse to get to the Easter show 150 years ago? Probably a fair few people. We've seen an animal industry which was the most effective and the most convenient way of achieving something, which was transport. We saw a technology, cars, come in, which was more convenient and more effective for most people, and that became the predominant form of transport over the last 100 years. We're seeing the same thing. There's still a horse industry. The horse industry hasn't gone away. It's changed. It's now a leisure industry, and it's a gambling industry and an entertainment industry for the very wealthy. And so I'm not at all suggesting that animal agriculture is going to disappear completely, but it's going to look very, very different. It's going to be for a very different segment of the market. And I also want to add here, there's going to be a lot of use for that marginal grazing country. There's a lot of new seed technologies coming in sorghum, which is going to produce sugar, which is going to need to feed synthetic biology industries. So it's not to say that 80% of Australia, which is only really usable for grazing, is suddenly going to be just returned to its natural state because it has no function. It's going to have a different function as part of a future value chain. Some of that will still be used for grazing at probably for much more premium products than they are today.
I wanted to put the issue that was raised about kangaroos to Jax in terms of why, because we've had scientists, we've had scientists from the University of New South Wales, Mike Archer, saying we should have kangaroo meat farms, and is that something that people are looking at as an option, considering the number of kangaroos we've got out there? Maybe we should.
Oh, look, funnily enough, second time I've been asked this question this week. I still don't really have a great answer for it. We very much have a charter for beef, lamb and goats. Most of my members and graziers would view kangaroos more as a pest than most. Sorry. There are issues with actual processing of kangaroos at this point. The actual kangaroo industry has huge amounts of hurdles to get past to become commercially viable at this point, and that changes to each state as well. So there are a lot of legislative issues that we have to get through before it becomes a more viable product. We did have a good export market for kangaroo into Russia. However, that's been ceased several years ago. So the actual viability of kangaroo as a commercial product has been questioned quite seriously. And there is actually issues going on within the pet food industry at the moment that is also challenging kangaroo. So I think we've got some cultural change before we'll get there. And I think we'll need some legislative change before we can get to actually making that a really viable product.
But it's only 20 years ago that people thought that goats were a pest, and now they're an important rangeland animal.
Oh, look, I'd say 5 years ago, a lot of people were still saying goats were a pest. Goats have been a fabulous vehicle for a lot of people during the drought. There's a lot of people using them instead of pesticides and herbicides and those sorts of things, so they're being used as alternative uses on farm as well as being an end product. But we're also seeing a huge increase in exports on goat. We've just done a huge promotion down at the Melbourne Food and Wine Festival, all on goat, and that's been amazingly well received because people are looking for a point of difference. And as these guys are offering, everyone's looking for choice, everyone's looking for something different, and goat is actually a really good product that's offering that right now. I wouldn't discount that Kangaroo will come back and do that if once society and legislation gets past that, yes.
Maybe some environmental imperatives as well.
Absolutely.
Any other questions from the audience? There's a question down there at the front. At the front there.
So this is a question for Olympia and George. Olympia, I really liked your analogy with the whole quinoa. That was a really good one, and I do believe with the changing habits of consumers that the options that both of you guys will be offering will be based on choice. So I agree with everyone's opinions. My question is, for example, I'll use steak as an example. There's different grades. So for example, someone will be paying more for Wagyu steak as opposed to a regular steak. So my question is, with cell-based meats and like insect farming, will there be different grades and will that affect pricing? And if not, are you both offering closing the gap of consumers having accessibility to just an all-rounder quality grade of protein, that it would sort of remove that pricing structure?
Yeah, so there is. So we farm black soldier fly larvae and mealworms at GoTerra, and we farm mealworms on dry grain-based waste streams because they are for human consumption. They can't handle putrescibles. We farm them on grape mark, and so that's an 8% protein product going in and an 87% protein coming out, and the flavour profile's different. So we send a lot of that to Japan because of their interest in wine and how that affects health. But our other input for the mealworms is bread waste. There's a lot of bread waste in Australia, and so those insects are actually a lower protein, and so there is a lower grade. But it's like any form of agriculture. I don't have soil and pasture, I have inputs. And the same with the black soldier fly larva. We farm black soldier fly larva on actual putrescibles. So this is stuff that has been thrown into the bin and intensive animal effluent. So the intensive animal effluent larvae have a protein of only 32%, and the putrescible larvae have a protein of 47%. It would stand to reason, if you just consider that from a commodity perspective, that those two different products would have a different value. For us, certainly that's how we approach it. Wheat has different values and different grains, so do other seed-based proteins, and so that's how it will come for us because our inputs will vary in the insect industry.
Any other questions from the audience? Yep, there's a couple down here.
Hey everyone, I'm Rayali, for those of you who don't know me, and 2019 RAS Rural Achiever. So my question is open but directed more at you, Olympia and George. Olympia, I've been on your maggot farm and you run a bloody efficient operation. So I was just wondering, what does global scalability look like and how do you stay competitive in that market? And also, George, how does lab meat stay globally competitive as well, especially when we compare against more mature markets like Israel, the US and Europe? And what's the differentiator for lab meat coming out of Australia?
I'll go first, if that's all right. That's an awesome question. So Australia has a couple of advantages here. One is, kind of ironically, all of that grazing land that we have, lab meat or any new industry that's employing biology to make high-value products outside of using animals or plants to do it is going to need input crops. It's going to need sugar, it's going to need amino acids, it's going to need other micronutrients and vitamins. we need to be able to grow that and produce that somewhere. And so Australia has a huge advantage in that we have a lot of land. We have a big sugar industry, which is starting to have some issues, especially with Indian imports, that can be redeployed immediately to start to fuel this industry. We also, as a nation, have a great deal of credibility in how we handle our food integrity systems. All of that, the ability to have the whole supply chain here, the deep expertise in tissue engineering, which already exists in Australia, and our national brand in food give us a pretty privileged global position, whether you're looking at insects, whether you're looking at cell-based meat, or whether you're looking at conventional animal agriculture, as all of those things are true across those industries. So Australia has an awful lot of advantages, and I firmly believe that we can be both excellent in producing outstanding red meat, at the same time we can be excellent in producing outstanding insect protein and cell-based proteins. And the split between those will change over time, but Australia can and should always be an outstanding global food producer, whatever type of food we're talking about.
Any other questions from the audience?
I was
Another
just
one
going to
down there.
answer
Oh,
that
sorry.
question. It's okay. So from my perspective, commercial scalability of new ag tech is a challenge in Australia, mostly because of our tall poppy syndrome. And I only knew that because I went away and married American, and they're all about, you're awesome. And so I could make ashtrays and sell them at the market, and my husband would think that's the coolest thing that ever happened. Australians don't do that, and we don't do that culturally. And so we do really great research, and we are not as awesome at commercializing and scaling that research. It's just a fact, and we have to start calling it out. So what I think about a lot when I think about scaling and growing GoTerra is the legacy that conventional farmers have put in place for ag tech in Australia, and that is in durability, resilience, and innovation. And so I think a lot about, and when you come to GoTerra, everything's painted blue to make it look uniform, but it is made from stuff I have either dragged from the side of the road or found secondhand on Gumtree and refurbed, and that is in keeping with how we farm. We just make do. We don't buy new things. We don't keep, you just try and reimagine what you already have. And I think that's really important when we consider about building out new ag tech, because we're not going to get the same funding as our Silicon Valley friends or as our Israeli counterparts. So we have to do more with less, as we always have, and do that better. So I think about scaling my business within the legacy of what conventional agriculture has said, how we do things. So I collaborate, I ask a lot of questions, I reach back to the ecosystem. How do you do that? How do I fit in with what you do? I try not to be autonomous or independent, and I think that's why we've had the success we've had, but it's literally I've just been copying my conventional peers.
I had George seemed to be talking about the price point for lab meat, and I was calling it lab meat. Apologise. Just he's better than Franken meat. You've got to admit that. We'll take that as well. The price point in terms of, you were sort of saying that it may be that if it's easy to produce high quality protein at a much lower cost, that's the sort of protein that's available to the world. No, actually it was a question for you, Olympia. Okay. Do you subscribe to that idea in terms of insects, that actually it may be a lower cost of producing a protein that will be more easily available, and that the Wagyu steaks will still be the ones that are sold in the developed nations? They'll be the ones that'll be getting the higher price points.
Like, insect farming has been built on the premise that it's a cheaper way to make protein, and it's a more sustainable, that's the investor facing pitch for pretty much every insect farmer out there. We can do this with a waste stream, which is a circular closed loop economy, save the world with maggots. That's an overarching conversation. It's not, as with any farming, you always start to see those who are trying to differentiate themselves within those market segments based on premium, based on scalability, based on different things. So it is agriculture in its essence, and so therefore you'll find there's grasshopper producers who sell their product as a premium product and are not interested in that product being like available to the masses. They want it to stay niche. Same with the green ants. Anyone that's not tasted a South Australian green ant or a Northern Territory green ant needs to go out and do that because they're amazing. There's a really nice gin if you're looking for an entree. They aren't interested in that being commercially available. And I think if we consider it as agriculture, then you will see availability across your socioeconomic margins, and they will be different based on how those farmers want to farm.
Any other questions from the audience? There's one down there.
Probably, but I'll go around anyway.
Hi, thank you so much for this discussion. It's incredibly interesting. My name is Rebecca Thistleplate, another rural achiever. I was just wondering, so Meat and Livestock Australia, Meat and Livestock in Australia, have to adhere to extreme ethical standards, and it's incredible what they do to produce their animals. I'm just wondering if insect production has the same ethical standards or a similar situation?
So I get asked at least 4 times a week whether or not my maggots are happy. So that is your baseline. People care. And I may not care because to me a maggot is not a sentient being, but I think we all know today it's not about whether or not you have those feelings, it's about whether or not your customers do. And so I care about how my maggots feel. Insects are different to sentient animals and vertebrates and mammals because of the way they interact. So I get asked a lot about overcrowding, which is an interesting conversation around maggots because maggots actually don't thrive if they're not together tightly. So it's an understanding and education piece. From an Insect Protein Association point of view, we have an ethical standard, a moral standard, a best practice relating to the safe husbandry of insects, and then we also have full biosecurity. So I took the Animal Health Australia Farm Biosecurity Plan and I maggoted it. So it is specifically now written exactly for insects. It covers insect-based biosecurity challenges. And we, as of last year, all the black soldier fly, so the biggest threat for illegal imports was black soldier fly eggs. We have sequenced the DNA for all states' strains of black soldier fly larvae, and handed those back to AQUIS or whatever we call them now, and do a lot of that integration. It's an emerging industry, so it's super hard to get as to speed as our conventional counterparts, but we are working really hard, and we have got a lot of that foundation in place already. So,
any other questions from the floor? No?
James Cleaver's my name. Mine's actually for George, and it's along the same accountability guidelines that we've talked about with the livestock and then across the maggots. Food processing in our generation has there's a theme there that there's sugars, there's additives that we've seen that have had negative effects on our health and on obesity statistics. How can we know that your product will continue to be pure into the future?
Good question. So James's question down there was how we've seen additives like sugars and fats have deleterious effects on people's health at a population level in general. How do we know that cellular agriculture products won't have that same sort of deleterious effect? Frankly, we don't know yet because there's not products that people are eating regularly. The way the industry is preparing for it is by being very, very deeply transparent about the nutrition of it, very deliberately undertaking nutritional studies early, and making an effort to create products that are more nutritious than their natural counterparts. So we have a chance to influence things like saturated fat content, nutrient density in a way that is very, very difficult to do in animal agriculture. And so the industry, to give you an example, crustaceans, so lobster or prawns, are about 30% cholesterol or 20% cholesterol. Is that right? I'm looking at Georgie, she'll know. So the companies that are looking at creating cell-based equivalents are substituting that cholesterol for omega-3s and omega-8s. So whilst the product tastes the same, it's actually got better nutritional properties than its naturally, the sort of wild-caught equivalent. But as I say, we won't know the full effects until we have products on the market and we can do proper long-term studies around it.
Did you want to follow up on that,
Oh, no.
Georgie?
I just think it's really, so, you know, we do work in this lovely world called food processing, and so what we produce and how it actually gets to a plate goes through a whole supply chain, as we know. So we are governed by the Food Standards Code in Australia, and so what you've got is this challenge around food regulation, being able to keep up with advances in evolution of production and consumer demand. So they're sitting in between. Food standards in Australia, as we know, are governed by not just the Department of Agriculture, they're governed by the Department of Health, and they're also governed by the Department of Industry. And so we've got, you know, 3 different lenses, which comes into the kind of community, social, health, rather than just do we have the infrastructure from a food safety, from a biosecurity, and have we followed processes we know are, you know, industry leading. And Australia has, you know, globally leading food standards sort of processes in Australia. So there is that challenge, and one of the things around emerging industries, and you see this not just in, you know, some of the ones we've talked about here today, we still see them in, you know, conventional industries. So I think about lupins and what we're doing around clinical trials in that space. So you do need to have a certain concentration to be able to deliver the clinical trials and human-based clinical trials that George is talking about to allow you to make claims around product health, product integrity. So back to the person's question around packaging and how do you know? You know, the claims on packaging have to be significantly substantiated. And there is a significant amount of research and trials and human trials that go into that scientific base to allow us to make those claims. So I think one of the challenge we have around emerging industries, you know, great to build them up, and we need to get the scale so that we can then influence and inform the needed, I guess, modernisation, which is a discussion that's happening at the moment, of our food standards regulation system, because we want to ensure that anything anyone produces is safe. And that's, you know, Australia Inc. is safe for not only Australian consumers, but our international consumers, and that our food safety standards regulation is the best it can be and the robust it can be, but can keep up with emerging industries. And I think that's a big challenge for the sectors around, you know, growing emerging industries and new industries, that we do have those same kind of regulation in a good way, so that we don't lose any integrity.
Any more questions? We're nearly out of time, so there's a question down the front.
This question's for the alternative protein growers. What's the biggest barrier right now for your industry to become profitable? Like, is it the demand or the technology, or
Money.
is that investors or?
In general. So I started a maggot farm in my garage, where all good startups begin. I had flies in my kitchen, which is a testament both to my family and my friendships. It's you to make that, put that into a shed and then grow that commercially. The capital infrastructure requirements, even with our modular unit system, which is far different from a factory floor solution, is still high. So a GoTerra factory solution, now that we've done all the R&D, is about 650,000. My nearest competitor's factory solution is about 5.2 million, and the highest one's running about 32 million globally for a factory solution. Even to get to through the R&D process to do that, like, that's a lot of money. Very few people have the privilege that I did to be able to work a Uber job and my family would still survive, thanks to my husband. Like, not everyone has that opportunity. And so building startups in this kind of capital-intensive industry is super hard. Then and it just trickles into every aspect. Hiring staff, like, how do you get an engineer? I'm not an engineer. I'm a cattle farmer, sheep farmer, come marketer. So I can tell a great story and I have really cool ideas, but I cannot execute that napkin drawing into a robot. And so somehow I have to con an engineer to work for free. You're still following this? To build me a robot with stuff I find from the green shed. Like, these things are really hard to manifest. So I believe the investment's out there. We have successfully raised a seed round from credible tech investors, Australian tech investors, but the effort that it takes to get there is extraordinary, and we don't have the pre-seed government grant funding to leverage that innovation. So ACT government has one of the only innovation grants in Australia that does not require actual financial input. So your half can be in kind. There isn't anything else out there for innovation. Everything else is you must come up with half the cash. And it's like, well, if I had half, I'd just do it. So it comes down to money from my perspective.
In the cell-based world, it's technology. There's a bunch of huge technology barriers still, mostly about scaling up. So there's small volumes can be produced at a lab scale. Small volumes can be produced at a lab scale relatively easily. Producing large volumes economically is where a lot of the scale-up challenges happen. So there's a lot of technical barriers still, but there's a lot of things coming in that are accelerating how fast those technology developments are happening.
Okay. I think we probably need to wrap it up now because there's a fashion parade that needs to set up this.
We're ready.
You ready? You ready? You got your lab meat ready? Your lab meat suit to put on? So we've talked about lab meat, we've talked about insect protein, we've talked about the traditional lamb and beef farms and what it might look like in the future, and it sounds as though it will be different. It will be a different future that we're facing. So thanks to our panel, Olympia, Georgie, and also Jax, and thank you for participating as well, and we'll have a great day.